Okay, so we've got our fireplace here. We've got a little bit of shading on it. I'm going to make some sticks to go into the fire, and I'm going to set them on fire, and it'll look like an oven with fire in it. Now, you could Google around. You could find pictures of sticks. You could find pictures of logs. But in keeping with the concept of creating everything from scratch, I'm going to make my own firewood. Let's make a new little transparent layer here. Grab my marquee tool, and I'll just make a little tiny square. Little rectangle shape there. And that doesn't look like much, does it? Well, let's fill it with some 50% gray. We'll hit OK. And let's give that some noise. Filter, noise, add noise. Looks like a pretty good amount of noise. Let's hit OK. You might think, what am I doing here? I'm going to make this into a stick. If I deselect, Command D, edit, transform, scale, and I stretch this. Whoops, if I hold the shift key, there we go, stretch it way out and hit return. Kind of looks like wood grain, doesn't it? Now the color is a little bit off. I could give it maybe a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And if I tell it to colorize, oops, I only want it to affect the layer below. I'm going to have to clip it. Again, a bunch of ways to clip. We could right click, choose create clipping mask. We could option click on that little line in between the two layers, or because it's an adjustment layer, you'll notice there's a little icon here that looks an awful lot like what you see when you hold the option key over this line. This will also clip or release, create or release a clipping mask. So once it's clipped, we can play around with the hue, we can play around with the saturation, and make it look like it's some kind of woody stick sort of color. Cool. Looks like although actually a stick would be kind of rounded on the edges, wouldn't it? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give this a layer mask. And with a paintbrush, B on the keyboard calls up your paintbrush, and with a fairly hard edge in this case, because I want to kind of round off the edge of this stick here, I'm just going to, with some black paint, so D on the keyboard, make sure you get your pure black and white foreground and background. X will reverse them. 100% opacity, fast way to get to 100%, 0 on the keyboard. I'll just round off the edge of that stick there. There we go. That looks more like a little piece of firewood kind of snapped off. There we go. And we'll set that down in the bottom there. Now, just one single log sitting on the bottom isn't going to make much of a fire. I'll duplicate this log. Now, if you're going to duplicate this stick here, I've got the layer for the stick and I've got the layer for the adjustment layer. If I just duplicate the stick layer, it breaks the clipping of the hue and saturation layer. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to make sure I have both these layers selected. And if I really knew that that stick was the way I wanted it to be, I could probably merge these layers quite comfortably. If I wanted to keep them adjustable, I could, with both layers selected, right click and duplicate layers. And both of those layers will get duplicated, the adjustment layer and the stick layer. So here's the first stick layer. If I move this one up, I have two sticks. Here's the upper stick, and here's the lower stick. Now, not being a sucker for punishment, I actually am going to merge these just because it'll make things a little bit simpler. So I'm actually going to merge both of those. And now with the Move tool, or V on the keyboard, and Auto Select turned back on, I can move these sticks individually. Now, they probably both wouldn't be facing the same direction, so I could do a Command T and I could rotate one of these. They probably wouldn't both be the same size, so I could do a Command T. I could maybe make one a little bit shorter. I could maybe rotate it the other way. I could have them crossing over top of each other. I could make more of them. Maybe I'll duplicate these guys, edit, transform. Maybe I'll flip them horizontally. Just play around with it, have a little bit of fun. How are we going to make it look like they're on fire, though? Where are we going to get some fire from? Wait a minute. In this week's folder, you'll notice a file called Flame. Let's call that file up. This is a picture of a match taken by Ron Irwin, and you'll notice it's got fire. It's got a match head, which wouldn't really make sense in our fireplace, but that's okay. We can deal with that. But it also has a slight bluish background. If we look at the levels for this thing, we've got in the red channel, here's white, here's black. Oh, nothing down here at 0. It's not until we get up around here, around 27 or so, that we actually start getting some of this tonality. In fact, probably all of that we'd want to get rid of. Same thing in the green channel. There's a flat spot. and a little bit of a mountain there. And in the blue channel, a flat spot. Ooh, even more in the blue channel. Look at this. If we go to the RGB, grab the black point and pull it up, any of this tonality that ends up to the left of the black point becomes black. If we went the other way and we grab the white point, any of this tonality that ends up to the right of the white point would become white. We can make it overall lighter and darker. This was our main one though, wasn't it? Take a look at that. By pulling this up, we can make that background go black. Now that'll be important once it's in our fireplace, but I'm not going to do it just yet. I'm going to put it into the fireplace first, and we'll play around with those blending modes and see if anything goes tragically wrong. So I'm just going to cancel out of that, and I'm going to take this fire and I'm going to duplicate it over to my fireplace document. I'll right click, I'll choose duplicate layer, and I'm going to call it fire. Again, I like to be creative in my naming. For the destination, it says, well, where do you want this to go? By default, it goes to its own document, in which case it would simply duplicate itself in our layers panel. But if I click on this pop-up, I can go to my brick wall document, which is actually my fireplace document. I just didn't save it and rename it, which I should probably do. But anyway, if I pop it to my brick wall document, when I hit OK, it looks like nothing happened. But when I pop over to my brick wall, there, hiding in the corner for some reason, is the fire. Now, how do we make it look like this log here, these sticks back there, are actually on fire? Well, we could play around with some of the blending modes. You might remember that blending modes, right now it's in normal, are basically different sets of rules that define how the pixels in this layer are going to interact with the pixels below. And each of these different blending modes is a different set of rules. If I were to try lighten or screen, actually, lighten looks like it's doing a better job there. Let's try lighten. Look at that. The rule for lighten blending mode is, it goes back to normal. The rule is the pixels in the layer are only going to be visible if they're capable of lightening the pixels below. So the black in the background, all the stuff around here, can't lighten this brick, so it turns invisible. Now, here's where the problem comes in. Remember, this had a slightly bluish background behind it. It's fairly light, it's not pure black. So when we get into lighten, you can actually see a little bit of that bluish cast getting carried into it. And it's actually even worse in screen blending mode. Any of that lightness that was in the background, all this kind of lightness back here, this is darker, but it's still not quite black. It shows up in the final image. What can we do about that? Well, I'm going to leave this in lighten blending mode. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do screen just so you can see this effect a little bit more strongly. And this layer itself, remember when we called up the levels, we could play with this black point. We could actually make that background black. What if we did that while the background is visible? And I want it to be non-destructive, so I'm going to use an adjustment layer. So there's my fire layer, and in fact, I'm going to name it fire. In fact, I thought I had named it before I sent it over. And I'm going to go to my adjustment layer pop-up, and I'm going to choose a levels adjustment layer. And watch what happens if I just grab the black point. It's darkening everything down below. I need to clip it to just the fire layer. So I'll hit this little icon, and you can see that it jumped over, that arrow appeared, and it's now only affecting the fire layer. Now, if I grab in the RGB, it pulls all three channels at the same time. If I want to get a little more specific, I could jump to the red channel individually and pull this endpoint up, jump to the green channel individually, and I'm basically pulling this black point up to the base of this little mountain here so that the darkest pixel in this channel becomes black. If I go to my blue channel, same deal, I can pull this one up. We need to go a little bit higher. Yeah, so all of this tonality ends up to the left of the black point. Now you can play around with this, try to get the fire looking exactly the way you want. Everyone's is going to be a little bit different. And that's looking kind of like fire in the fireplace. Now the problems I'm noticing with this, first off, there's still a match down there, kind of a ghostly match floating over top, which is, well, it's weird. And the top of the match, the top of the flame is cut off. If we look at just the fire, oh yes, it was cut right off the top of the screen there. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I'm just going to give it a layer mask. With a layer mask and some black paint, so B on the keyboard, get the paintbrush, D on the keyboard, get the pure default colors, black and white, X to switch them around, 0 on the keyboard to get that 100% opacity. I also want a nice soft edge on the brush, so I can click on this pop-up here, take the hardness all the way down, or if you don't want to have to go all the way up to there, you can simply right-click, and this menu will pop up. We can pull the hardness down, hit the return key, and I can soften out that top of the flame, and I can get rid of the match down there just by painting some black over top of the layer mask. And if I grab my move tool, V on the keyboard, there's the fire just kind of floating there. If I want to make it look a little more enthusiastic in the fire department, I could duplicate this fire layer. Notice I have both the adjustment layer and the fire layer itself. And by duplicating it, I could then move it. It just looks like two of the same. I could, let's do a little flip. Transform, if we flip that horizontally, oh, that looks like some kind of creepy face. What if I played around with the size? Command T calls it my free transform. I could make one larger. I could rotate it. Have it looking a little more fire-like in there. Yeah, starting to look a bit more like fire. And I can make as many copies of this as one. I could duplicate. I could pull this one over. I could make it face the other way. I could make it smaller or larger. Maybe something like that. There we go. There's my fire. Now, if these sticks were really on fire, they would probably be darkened quite a lot, wouldn't they? So I'm going to do some shading, much like I did around the inside of the fireplace. I'm going to do some shading around in here. Here's my stick layers, which are very non-creatively named. Actually, I'll call this stick 1. So there's my sticks. And I could shade each one individually. I can make a new transparent layer, clip it to it, and with the paintbrush, soft brush, maybe 20-30% opacity or so, I could do a little bit of shading just on that one stick. But what if I wanted to do all the sticks at the same time? Let me throw that layer out. If I were to select all of these stick layers, click on the top one, hold down the Shift key, get that bottom stick layer, and right-click, I could put them both into a new group. Call it sticks. And hit return. And if I make a new transparent layer and clip it to that group, now I can take my paintbrush and I can add some shading onto all these sticks at the same time. Now I don't have the same degree of control as if I had done them individually, but for these purposes I think that'll work just fine. There we go, some nice burned sticks in the bottom there. Now I'm thinking the bottom of this fireplace would be much darker than that if these sticks had been burned over there. So I will move down to the floor of the oven. That's it right there. And there's the layer. I'll call this darkening floor. Grab my paintbrush and do a little bit more darkening down there. You can see why I said it doesn't really matter if these edges don't match up perfectly, because we're really going to be putting a whole lot of soot and fire and stuff in there. So there we go. We got some fire in our fireplace. You can play around with the size of it as you need, as you see fit. Next, we're going to take a look at adding a little bit of a concrete ledge in the front. You notice that in Ron's version, he's got a little ledge where you can put a little pizza or something. So we'll add that in the next lecture.